Peace be with you, and welcome to the Men for God podcast. Today we will interview Raymond Ibrahim. Mr. Ibrahim is a noted historian and scholar with expertise in the Middle East and Islam. He has appeared in several notable publications, such as CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has also offered counsel and expertise to the US government. Today, he will talk about how the West has forgotten its history, specifically its history and interactions with Islam, and how understanding this history will help Christians in the West face the challenges that are in front of them. Hope you enjoy it. God bless.
I want to start with a quote from your book, The Sword and the Scimitar. And it says, "We tend nowadays to forget that for approximately 1,000 years, from the advent of Islam in the 7th century until the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, Christian Europe was under constant threat from Islam, a double threat of conquest and conversion." So the question would be, sir, why is it that Westerners, and more specifically Christians, have forgotten this history? And how does that ignorance impact us today?
Well, the reason they forgot it is probably multifaceted, but probably the number one reason is it's intentional. The way history is taught nowadays in the West, especially in anything public, government funded, public schools, etc., is obviously narrative based. Okay, and the dominant narrative nowadays is that everything in the Europe's pre-modern existence was backwards, benighted, and because it was Christian, and everything was good afterwards, starting with the Renaissance and then so-called humanism, etc., etc. So everything before that was just barbarism and the Dark Ages, as they call it. So everything has to conform to this, and one of the narratives, of course, which has political modern-day ramifications, has to do with Islam. So Islam is supposed to be the enlightened one historically, the peaceful one, the tolerant one. Andalusia, Spain. We can talk about that and the lies involved with it. So in order to maintain that narrative, which is Christians backward, everyone else progressive, open-minded, enlightened, peaceful, Christians violent, attacking the other, that what you just read, that quote, has to be suppressed because it completely throws a wrench in everything. When people learn that, in fact, it's the opposite. Muslims for 1,000 years were actually attacking and bombarding every corner of Europe, and they went as far as Iceland just to get slaves. So that's, I think, the number one reason that they just everything, and this is just one aspect of the Islam thing. Everything now in history is such a potent tool for any kind of political point someone wants to make in the now, because they manipulate history. So it's a form of, if you change the premises, the conclusion is different. So you have to go back in history and change things up. So that's why I think they do it. And like I said, the Islam aspect, it's a big one, but there's so many other things that they're also manipulating actively in order to validate whatever narrative they're trying to sell.
What impact has that had on Christians then, on the church?
Well, I think with Christianity, there's it's kind of like there's a double-edged sword where, liberalism has also invaded Christianity, at least in the West. And by West, I mean both denominations, Protestant and Catholicism. And the problem is because there's teachings in Christianity which seem to comport with leftist thinking. Okay, so for example, turning the other cheek, forgiving, being tolerant, all that sort of thing seems to work hand in hand with the sort of leftist worldview, which expects people to just essentially be doormats and not resist whatever it is they want to bring in or support. And I think that's the problem. So nowadays, wherever you look, I remember, for example, in the Super Bowl in the United States, of course, those are the big commercials. And one of the commercials, all it was images of people washing other people's feet. And it didn't say anything. And then at the end, it just said, Jesus didn't teach hate, he washed feet. Okay. But then if you looked at the images, it was, they were all had such political aspects. It was always, all the people washing feet were all white, and they all had a sort of conservative look to them. It was a priest or a clergyman. And the people that were washing their feet were, you know, LGBT people, Mexican migrants or illegal aliens, just anything you can imagine. And the idea, of course, is a true Christian does not protest any of these things. He actually just acquiesces. And of course, that's the kind of Christianity that works hand in hand with what we call the left wants to do in the world. It actually is an accomplice of it, that kind of Christianity. I call it doormat Christianity. But of course, it's a complete contradiction to historic Christianity, which was not like that at all. It's very muscular, very assertive. It's not evil. It's not offensive. It doesn't go out of its way to attack. It's defensive based, you know, just war theory. That's what it goes around. So anyway, that's why what I think is sort of why Christianity is very much being undermined by so-called leftist forces, is because there's a kernel of truth in some of those sorts of teachings. They are biblical and part of the church's teachings, but they're pulled out of context and they're not given any balance. And of course, there should be balance to it.
Is this a problem just in the West, or is this happening all over the world?
Within Christianity, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, you know, when you leave the West and you talk about the East, in my mind, all I think of is orthodoxy, whether it's the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches or the Eastern Orthodox churches, Russia, Greece, and so forth. I don't know. I mean, I can't say that it's infiltrated the theology system of these churches, but it's just it's part of the culture. I don't see it really very much in the Eastern churches. So I mean, that's seen as some sort of as one bastion. And one interesting aspect of it is because those are the churches and the peoples who actually have a long experience with Islam. So when you look at these countries, most of them are Orthodox. You know, Russia, of course, is one of them, and Catholic. You know, you have Poland and Hungary and so forth. And these are the nations that are very resistant towards Muslim migration, and they're very open about it. But they also tell you, because we were the ones who most recently were under Islamic domination, Ottoman Empire times. You know, I mean, as early as 1683, Vienna was encircled by 200,000 to 300,000 jihadists, and Hungary was under Ottoman rule for about 150 years. So I think, without really getting into the theology, I think that the experience of the Eastern peoples and their churches are such that they're wary of Islam. And, you know, this idea of trying to turn them into doormats and convince them that the totality of Christian teaching is just turning the other cheek and doing nothing else. I mean, remember, Jesus, who said turn the other cheek, actually did not turn the other cheek. The one time he was slapped, he actually questioned and put on the spot the man who slapped him. And he also, you know, he created a whip of cords or cord of whips and whipped people and overturned tables. You know, so there is room, obviously, based on just the words and actions of Jesus, for what would be considered righteous wrath or even violence. And that's the part that has been completely, you know, obliterated, intentionally, obviously, because like I said, if you hate Christianity, wouldn't you love to support a passive, toothless Christianity that teaches Christians to do nothing but just acquiesce? So I think that's the problem, really.
So in the collective mind, where obviously the West has had peace for a long time as well now, so it fits with the kind of peace and tolerance and kind of keep maintaining this peaceful society to change Christianity to suit our needs. Switching to the Islamic mindset, do they have the same historical amnesia when they view things, when they view recent wars? What is their mindset like when it comes to history?
No, Muslims when it comes to their own history, and it's not only that they remember their own history, but they're the exact opposite of the West. Whereas the West will intentionally demonize its heritage, Muslims will whitewash their heritage and praise it and disseminate and teach it to the younger generations. But either way, the history of Islam is, you know, just go back to the so-called Islamic State, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And if you look at how they were and what they did, and the atrocities and the massacres and the concubinage of Yazidis and others, and beheading and crucifixions and putting people in cages and extracting jizya, tribute, from conquered so-called Dhimmi populations, that is historic Islam. That's exactly how Islam spread. Muslims know that, and we get this information not from biased infidel sources. It's from Muslim sources, Arabic historians, Turkish historians, Persian historians, etc. That's how they describe it. The great Arab conquests of the 7th century, for example, and the Ottoman conquest, and the Berbers in the West, in Spain, and so forth. And Muslims are aware of this, but of course, it's always euphemized. So the Arabic word conquer is never used, or conquest. They use the word fath, which means opening. So when they conquer a region, they've opened it to the light of Islam. Okay, so obviously there's a serious euphemism there. So even though their entire religion is on the offense and violent and conquest oriented, in their mind it's seen as an altruistic thing, because you're bringing the light of Islam to wayward infidels, and that's just the way it has to be. But yeah, Muslims are very different than the West when it comes to history. Not only are they very knowledgeable of it, but they venerate it. They venerate those people and their ancestors, etc., which is so the exact opposite of what's happening here in the West.
What are some of the action, or what? No, not some of the action points. What is our response for those who are aware of this within the church? It feels like a lot of the church is very passive to this or blind to it. What can we be doing to the ones who are awake to this?
Well, I like to just get to the root of the problem. And even though, to me, the Islam question in Europe, for example, and I mean, you two are in the UK, so you obviously are very familiar with the Islam problem. But it's actually, that's a side effect of the issue. The real issue isn't Islam. I mean, if the UK or France or Germany decided to be like Hungary or Poland, then the problem would dissipate immediately. So it's not that, historically Islam was invading Europe, and it was sometimes winning and conquering and all the atrocities. But now all the Muslims there are brought in by the powers that be in whichever European country you want to talk about, the UK, for example, or wherever. So the real problem is actually internal. It's your governments. It's the culture. It's the mainstream media. It's the narrative. So I think that's so even though Islam is it manifests itself in a very prominent way, it's just a side effect of the real problem. And there's no way to really fight Islam itself there. You actually have to kind of get to the head of the snake, as it were, which, like I said, is an internal fifth column sort of thing. So the more people understand this, I suppose, and address it in whichever way need be, is the way to go. So
in your work, Sid, obviously you've written a number of books on this issue. What is it that you're trying to? What is your aim in it? What is your aim that you're trying to teach the West?
Well, I mean, ultimately, as a historian, I just want to get the truth out. And the books that I've written, Sword and Scimitar and Defenders of the West, are really meant to be sort of correctives to the domineering narrative in history. Like I said, if you go to college or if you open an elementary school textbook or whatever, and Islam makes an appearance, it's just it's a tolerant, peaceful force that spread peacefully, et cetera, et cetera. So all I'd like to do is just set a corrective, and then for people to understand. Again, like I said, history is often treated as an unimportant discipline, but to me, it's one of the most important, because it's, like I said, it's the first premises, and that's how you know what the conclusion is. So they're always manipulating those premises to fit their fabricated conclusion. But if you understand, in other words, for example, when 9/11 happened, the attack in the US, everyone, the big question was, why do they hate us? Okay, and why was that a dominant question? Because everyone was taught Islam is peaceful, Islam is tolerant, Islam, et cetera, et cetera. Now, had they known the history that it is delineated and documented in, let's say, my 2 books, there is no question why they hate us. I mean, that's right there. This is just conquest. It's jihad. It's just, and there's propaganda and there's lies, which Al-Qaeda engaged in, and so forth. So it's obviously very helpful to have the truth. and that would be my personal endeavor, to just provide it for people, because it's not being done really by the professional historians.
You talk about the problem obviously being at the top of the government. So the elite, are they not aware of the history of Islam? Are they not aware of like the Middle East? And is it
No,
that they're not?
I think they're very much aware, but ultimately, you see, to them, Islam is sort of, it's a tool. I think their true enemy is the church. It's Christianity. That's what surrounds them in Europe, because that's the home of Christianity. And so they have no problem bringing in people who inherently hate Christianity and who go around destroying and defacing and vandalizing churches and whatever. I think that's it's the concept of my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's really, it's always so incongruent when you look at the left, okay, or liberals, and then you look at Islam and somehow they're allies, when in fact they're so antithetical to one another. But it really is about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Their greater enemy really is Christianity. And so they can actually sort of overlook their own problems and focus on undermining, Christian mores and ethics and civilization and its image. So I think that's why you have so many of the so-called left that are very supportive of Islam. And I know you can probably tell me more about the UK, but whenever I read about certain countries like France, it seems like maybe like 5 churches are desecrated every day. And I'm sure there's the so-called, the equivalent of what we have is Antifa or whatever, Satanists or leftists or LGBT people who are doing it. But it's also a huge chunk are Muslims as well. And it's interesting that both those groups like to target and attack and burn, in many cases, churches. So I think the left knows very much what it's doing, and it knows the history of Islam. But hey, bring them in and let them just attack, the peasants and the Christians and their churches, and let them clear the way for us.
I think it's on both sides what you're saying. There's kind of the Islamists, the fundamentalists who are driving their things, and then there's the far left pushing their agenda. I think what we have in the UK specifically is the church doesn't really have any kind of voice. It's become almost like an ornament of history, and it's involved in our ceremonies. You may see a king being crowned or a prime minister being sworn in, but the church has retreated into this role. So I think it's much tougher, or it's a much bigger ask for the church to reassert itself, or even its values, its morals, its teachings, because it's retreated for so long. And I think the work we do, and what we hope to do, is just remind Christian men of the history, remind them who they are and of their calling, to deny themselves, to not consider their own comfort or their own material prosperity, but what we're passing on for generations to come. You're obviously from, you descend from Egypt, is it, sir? Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm of the Coptic Christians from Egypt.
Yeah, so it's obviously you'll have that kind of that historical memory passed on throughout your ancestors of what happened, and I think ours has just been completely wiped away.
I think we still live as though we're the majority, and we don't raise our children as though we are the minority, and that's the biggest issue in the church, is we're passive. We think that we still think we're a Christian nation, and we're so far past that. I don't think we're ready for what is happening and what is about to happen. I really, when I look at the UK now, I'm reminded of 1930s Germany, and I almost feel like I'm a Jew, sort of waiting for everything to turn on me.
Just from a Coptic perspective, Egypt is an ancient historically Christian place. So many great church fathers, theologians came out of there. What could we mimic from the Coptic Church in Egypt? What lessons can we learn from your people?
Well, the only lessons you're really going to learn from the Coptic Church is how to survive, and hopefully you don't get to that point. In fact, the Coptic bishop in Germany just 2 weeks ago, or maybe less, and I wrote an article about it, should be coming out, but he basically gave this warning. He said, our future is going to be our story is going to be your story. He said it to the German people because of Islam, because not only is the Muslim population in Germany so overwhelming, but they're engaging in all the usual violence and intolerance and criminality, et cetera, et cetera. And he was basically warning them about that. And he made some interesting points, which I've been saying as well, which is, you have to keep watching the curve of numbers, not just because the more it grows, the worse it is demographically for Germany, but the behavior changes. And this is actually part of Islamic teaching. Behavior is dictated very much on circumstance. And in a nutshell, when weak and small and outnumbered, they're supposed to preach peace and coexistence. And when strong and in the majority, they go on the offensive and the jihad resumes. And that's what he was alluding to. So, but, the real lessons, I mean, in the end, Egypt, as you were saying, it was one of the most fiercely Christian nations. Someone called it was as Christian as Alabama. And it really was when you think about it in that context, because it was, like you said, so many of the early church fathers, the Nicene Creed was actually by an Egyptian, Athanasius, which all the major denominations still recite and cling to. Even the first heretic, Arius, came out of Egypt. So, and how did it go from that to what it is today, which is about 90% Islamic and the home of the Muslim Brotherhood and the home of a lot of radical stuff, is because they couldn't fight off Islam. The only difference, of course, is when Egypt was attacked, they fought back and they lost, and so did all of North Africa, and so did the Byzantines, Eastern Roman Empire in Syria and so forth. They fought and they lost. The difference here now in Europe is they could fight, they could win. They don't even have to fight. They just don't have to bring Muslims in. So the dynamic is so completely different. It's much worse. It's one thing to be invaded and fight back and lose, and there's another thing to just suicidally bring in people who are openly calling for your demise and takeover of your country. So, the only lesson would be how to survive. And like I said, hopefully it doesn't get to that, though it might, unfortunately.
Looking at the future or even the present, in a sense, how would this time now compare? Does it ring any bells for you historically with any other periods, or is this unique?
No, it doesn't. I've never seen, from a historical point of view, some people. I mean, one of the parallels, I suppose, is sort of the late Roman Empire, because they just didn't have enough of population, and they started absorbing the Germanic tribes and using them as auxiliaries and essentially hiring them. So, sort of Europe is hiring, for a lot cheaper wage migrants. And relying on them because they have an older population. So that sort of happened, but even then it was a pragmatic decision. It wasn't, our culture is bad and our religion is bad and we want to, we have to be open-minded and multicultural. That component was not there. It was pragmatic, and it worked for a while, but then it didn't. Eventually the Germanic tribes overran the Roman Empire. Even though they came in, a lot of them came in as refugees who were being pushed westward by the Huns and other nomadic tribes. And Rome just said, okay, we'll make use of you. We're going to turn you into auxiliary frontiersmen. And they did, and it worked. And then eventually they took over Rome and sacked it. So, the parallels are there, but not this particular parallel where you bring them in on the concept of altruism. Okay, where we want to help you and we're going to give you land, and see, this is where the Christian thing comes in, because now you can see how Christianity is being tapped into. This is the Christian thing to do. But like I said, everything is done with balance. Even with Christianity, Jesus himself said, "Be as wise as serpents." Okay, so it's not you're not supposed to be naive and openly empower your own demise. Yeah.
What advice would you give to men for God, men for Christ in these times?
Well, maintaining, of course, the faith and, all the principles of Christian living are important. And I think just collectively getting together and discussing these things and being clear-sighted on what we're talking about, the more and more and more people who become like that, that's obviously good. You can even technically probably get representatives in the government who think the same way, if the numbers grow enough. So it's really, like I said, it's very unprecedented in many ways from a historical point of view what's happening. But and the lesson of my last book, Defenders of the West, that's what it's about. It's about, the subtitle is The Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. But you can actually get lessons from it about standing against anything that's aggressive or evil or whatever. And those guys, they just fought fire with fire. They didn't play games. They sacrificed everything. A lot of them were kings and emperors and nobles who could have just, stayed home and not worried about it. It's not my problem, but they threw themselves into the fray and they did what they had to do. And sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. Okay, but I think if more men fought that way, all these problems would very quickly dissipate. And so I think another part of the problem is sort of complacency and just laziness and not wanting. I think the problem with the West is it's still too affluent, so it doesn't. Nobody wants to rock the boat, because even when you talk about, there's poverty, from a world standard, the people who are poor are rich, and they just they don't want to lose what they have or really inconvenience themselves. So I think that's one of the components, but there's obviously many others.
So I just want to thank you for your time. Defenders of the West, it was a book I read last year. It really opened my eyes to Christian history, and I pray that people would watch this and they would wake up to what we're facing and also how men have overcome before. So thank you, Raymond, for your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Bless you, sir.
Thanks.